lands of the Watchaballik, the Jadwa, Jadwajali, Wagaya and Yapagot people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. The effects of COVID-19 has certainly been widespread, and the events sector was one of the very first industries where we saw immediate and ongoing disruption. Very early in the COVID-19 period, Wimmera Development Association recognised that the cancellation and/or postponement of events in Wimmera Southern Mallee was going to have significant financial and social implications for our region. And we knew that it was important to capture this information. And not only for historical purposes, but also to get a better understanding of the importance events play in our region and to help ensure the successful return of our many varied and vibrant events. Over the course of a number of weeks, Melissa Morris from Women's Health Grampians, and I see she's joined us today, hello Melissa, and myself contacted over 40 event coordinators, many of you who are here today, who graciously gave their time to complete our survey and to share their stories, some of which were quite heartbreaking to hear. And that was in regards to the impact that COVID-19 had had on their events. And for everyone that participated in those surveys, I thank you. And whilst today we will primarily look at the economic impact of the cancelled events to our region, I would like to think that this presentation will also provide reassurance that your event is valued and an important part of what makes our region special. And the countless hours of volunteer work and the undeniable stress that at times goes along with organising events is indeed worth it and would be terribly missed should they not return. I would now like to introduce our presenter today, Mr. Wayne Street of Street Ryan and Associates, who on behalf of Wimmera Development Association analysed the information gathered in these surveys and compiled the impact report which is being presented today. And I must say it has been a great pleasure to work with Wayne on this project, and we are extremely grateful for the insight that Wayne is able to provide. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Wayne to start the presentation.
Very good. Thank you very much, Vanita, for that great introduction. And I should, in response, add my thanks to you and Melissa in particular for your efforts in all the hard work that you put in interviewing the 41 odd events that we were able to identify around the region. And of course, to those who are present that gave up their time to contribute to the survey work as well. I'm going to try and share the screen now, Vanita, if that is okay, and start to take you through some of the results. Okay. So yes, we are going to talk about the events that were cancelled or postponed during what's turned out to be just part of the period that Victoria has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the period that is in question that we covered was from the start of the staged lockdown through to the end of May, which was the 22nd of March to the end of May. And I think it's pretty clear to everybody here that everybody would realise that the host of community, cultural, sporting and agricultural events and festivals that are staged throughout the Wimmera are a really important part of the social fabric of the region. And in fact, I'd even go a bit further than that and say that if we added to that list of events all the business travel and the business events that go with it that we didn't assess in this project, that in some cases around the region, it makes up a fairly large part of the total visitor economy, maybe even the lion's share of the visitor economy in the local government areas of the region, with the big exception, of course, of northern Grampians, where the tourist attractions at the Grampians probably swamped the events. But in the rest of the region, these events, together with business travel, make up a big proportion of the visitor economy, as we'll see as we go through the presentation today. During the pandemic, all of the events that were due to be held during the period from the 22nd of March to the end of May had either been cancelled or postponed. And I guess as time continues, the bigger proportion of them that were hoping for just a postponement are now shaping up to a potential cancellation as well. And I think that period of time is particularly relevant because that autumn period of time covering the Easter period and the Anzac Day period is quite often one of the biggest seasons for events around the region. So it's a period that has a disproportionately high number of the events throughout the region. Of the 41 events that we were able to identify and include in our assessment, 24 of them were in the Horsham rural city, 6 of them were in northern Grampians, 6 of them were in Yarra Ambiac, 3 in Hindmarsh and 2 in West Wimmera. So we covered the entire region, and although it looks like there's a disproportionately high number in the Horsham rural city, I'd also point out that the 6 in the northern Grampians were almost as significant as the 24 in Horsham rural city, because they had a couple of very large events that were included there, including the stall gift and the Grape Escape, which are pretty significant events. Our estimates from the results of feedback that have been given through the surveys and the use of Tourism Research Australia information about the contribution made by visitors is that the cancellation or postponement has cost the region $16.1 million in direct expenditure during that season, and that it affected 66,246 participants, which includes customers, spectators, community groups, and the organisers and the volunteers. And as a result, we've lost 28,800 day trips and 37,375 overnight visits, which would have been 76,000 odd overnight visit nights. So it's a pretty substantial impact on the region. We tried to classify the events into the main area of interest, and obviously some of them overlapped a little bit, so it wasn't quite as clean cut as we thought it would be to begin with, but we've classified them as 14 being in the community sector, 15 in sport and recreation, and 9 in cultural and 3 in agribusiness. And the sport and recreation ones don't include normal sporting competitions, which you could argue might be events in their own right. You know, anytime there's a football match played, for example, it's a mini event, but we didn't include those. So the sporting and recreational events tend to be ones that were inter-regional programs, or maybe even once-off type sport and recreation events. In indirect terms, we've estimated another 7.6 million as lost as the 16.1 flowed through the supply chain, making a total of nearly $24 million in lost expenditure to the region through the cancellation or postponement of the events. The event managing organisations, of which many of you are part, estimated that their total loss in revenue was about $1.3 million. And I have to hasten to point out that not everybody gave us the details of what their expenditure was going to be, partly because some of them didn't know what it was. So that's a very conservative figure, the 1.3 million. And that flowed on to about $150,000 in surpluses to the organisations which were lost. If we look at how it all worked through the various components of the event sector, we had 15,000 volunteer hours contributed, and we conservatively estimated that to be worth $338,000 in volunteer input, which, if you do a quick calculation, that turns out to be about $20 per hour, which $22 per hour, I think, to be exact, which is a pretty low figure for volunteerism, but it's one that's accepted, bearing in mind that volunteers aren't necessarily skilled in the area that they're making a contribution in. The event organisers, we estimated that their loss, again, bearing in mind that some didn't give us all the figures, was just over $1 million, and $118,530 of that had already been spent. The event participation, the biggest contribution, all those visitors, whether they be from country Victoria, from Melbourne or elsewhere, we lost nearly $15 million in expenditure generated through their visitation, and then the flow on, as I said before, of about $7.6 million to the rest. All that adds up to almost $24 million. Just looking at our events across the region, and we've got, oh, that's an old table, sorry, that's showing Horsham still at 23 and Northern Grampians at 7. There was actually one that referred to Great Western, which I miscalculated as being in Northern Grampians, thinking it was a Great Western, and it turned out to be in Horsham. So it's 24 in Horsham and 6 in Northern Grampians. 5 in the combined Hindmarsh and West Wimmera, and 6 in Yarriambiack, making our total of 41. Now, at the time that Vanita and Melissa interviewed people, 46% of those 41 events, which is about 20 of them, were saying that they were cancelling entirely for 2020. Some expressing concern that they may not be able to recommence their event at all due to potential loss of sponsors and loss of volunteers, or just general loss of momentum. And along those lines, 51% of the events, which is 21 of them, suggested that they did have sponsors. So just over half of the events had sponsors that they were hoping to retain. 44% of the events were hoping to reschedule later in 2020, and 15% had actually sent a rescheduled date, or set a rescheduled date, I should say. Hopefully they've been able to still have that on the horizon, although some of those may now have dropped off and not been able to reschedule. And 10% of them were events that said that they would resume their event activities as soon as the COVID restrictions disappeared. And they were mainly events like markets and the park runs and so on, which are obviously regular either monthly or weekly events that were hoping to get back on track as soon as the restrictions were lifted. Some of them may have already resumed, and others are still yet waiting for that to happen. That table also shows the number of participating organisers and volunteers that were involved, and there's 1,114 people involved in helping to organise those events around the region, of which 96%, so the overwhelming majority, were volunteers. The volunteers really make up a key part of the contribution to the region's events. For those people who were event participants, we estimated those that were staying overnight, whether they were staying in private accommodation, meaning they were staying with friends and relatives or with some other billeting type arrangement, their contribution to that $15 million of visitor expenditure was about $1 million. Day visitors, people that were just coming in and out for the day and not staying overnight, just over $3 million. And people staying in commercial accommodation, which includes everything from caravan parks right through to hotels, motels, B&Bs, Airbnbs and so on, was the biggest proportion at just nearly $11 million. In terms of the distribution of this, just put that in a bit of a table, which is probably hard to digest during this session, but you might have a chance to have a look at it later. The visitation to the Horsham events was the biggest share of that was day visitors, 22,101 day visitors, because a lot of the Horsham events were small or single day events, like those to the Horsham Town Hall, to the gallery there, and things like park runs and other day events. Surprisingly, a large number of people from outside the region attending, 17,000 odd from other country Victoria. But you can see the Northern Grampians figures is made up by a huge proportion of overnight visitors, meaning that their events tended to be ones that were at least 2 days or more, or requiring at least an overnight stay, which tended to mean that the contribution from the Northern Grampians was almost as much as those from Horsham, even though the number of events were fewer. Overnight visits to Yarriambiack, also quite high. And bear in mind that the period that we covered included the Y-Fest and all the sub-events that go with the Y-Fest that would have taken place in Yarriambiack, as always, in 2020. All right, so in terms of putting this in context, I thought it'd be worth just showing you how much the total visitor economy is in the Wimmera region. And just to look at Horsham Rural City, based on the last available local government area profile from Tourism Research Australia, the visitor economy in Horsham Rural City is worth around about $93 million, of which day trip visitors make up $48 million and overnight visitors make up $46 million. The average overnight visitor spends about $144 per night, and the overnight visitors, the day trip visitors spend $144 per day per visit, and the overnight visitors spend about $101 per day during their stay for each day they stay. Northern Grampians is a bigger visitor economy, which is no surprise. Horsham's visitor economy is largely made up, as I said before, of things like events and business tourism, whereas the Northern Grampians, containing Halls Gap and the Grampians themselves, clearly is a much more holiday vacation destination. So day trip visitors is not as high there, only $20 million and $87 per day, but overnight visitation, $86 million, nearly double the number in Horsham at $134 per day. And then the other shires, the rest of the Wimmera Mallee tourism region, $30 million in total, and $30 million in total for day trip visitors and $41 million for overnight visitors. Now, the reason this is relevant is I want you to be able to use this later to update what your event might be contributing and to use it as leverage for showing how significant your events are compared to the overall regional economy. So let's just look at what we need to measure when we calculate what's involved in an event. So there's three different levels to it. There's the event suppliers and the preparation that goes into an event. I'd call that all the pre-event type activities. And that includes economic contributions from the media, from the trades related sectors, electricians, plumbers, carpentry, that sort of stuff, the printing industry, insurance, sponsors, of course, ground preparation, and so on. Those sorts of things, all the things that go into making the event ready to occur on the day. Conducting the event obviously includes things like venue hire and use, catering, which may not be a direct expense of the organising body. It may be just an outsourced thing to caravans or to mobile vans that are providing catering services, or others who are providing catering for events or corporate facilities and so on. Information technology, the officials, entertainers, any awards, and the participants themselves, which is the biggest part of it. And then the flow on to local businesses obviously has the most direct relevance to businesses like cafes and restaurants, accommodation providers, retail outlets, some healthcare people, and recreation and so on. So they're the sorts of things we need to measure. So I want to talk a little bit now about how you as event managers can use the results from this study that's been undertaken by WDA into the future. And I've classified it into three areas: to update what we've done and to firstly calculate it even for this first year, then to demonstrate the worth of your events to people like councils, government organisations, and to demonstrate to them that it's often quite as big as many of the local businesses in terms of the contribution that the event makes during the year. And then finally, to show to businesses in local towns how much the events make up of the total tourism sector and get their support, maybe in helping to promote your event in the future through either deals or discounts, vouchers, and maybe even sponsorships. So let's go through those three things one at a time, starting with the update bit. And although we've spent a fair bit of time putting this report together and we've used all sorts of input, including the survey results and results from Tourism Research Australia, it's not that hard for you to be able to calculate yourselves what your event contributes. As event organisers, you will know what the pre-event costs have been, and you will know what sorts of costs your organisation is likely to occur during the event. So the one missing part to that is how much were we going to be able to count for lost expenditure or expenditure that we're going to derive from visitors to the event. And if we go back to the slide I showed a little bit earlier, which talked about how much a day visitor spends and how much an overnight visitor spends. If we took an example of an event that's conducted, say, in Hindmarsh Shire, and it's expecting to get 2,500 participants, of which the event group estimates that 1,000 of those will be overnight visitors and 1,500 will be day visitors. And to calculate the economic contribution from that, the direct one, it's pretty straightforward. It's the 1,500 day visitors times $75 a day, assuming it is a whole day event, not just a part day event, but people just come in for a few hours. But most of the ones that we've assessed this year have been at least whole day events. And then we add to that the 1,000 overnight visitors times the $109 that they'd spend if it was just a one overnight stay. Some of them who are here for a 2-day event may be staying 2 nights. So we're probably underestimating here by coming up with the sum of that calculation as $221,500 as the total direct contribution. Important to point out here that this is not a net contribution to the local area. Net contribution means it's money that is being spent by non-locals, and we haven't quite got to that level. We don't know how many of our day visitors, for example, are people who already live in the Wimmera region. You might know that, and therefore you might be able to calculate the money that's coming in from people from outside the area. But what we've focused on in our report to you has been the total contribution, because we think it's still significant. People may not spend the money doing something else if they didn't come to that event. You'll obviously know what other expenditure the organisers have incurred. And to make the flow-on effects simple, you could use a sophisticated economic impact model like REM plan, and maybe WDA could help you to do that if you wanted to apply the REM plan results to the direct figures. But we calculated it specifically for this assessment, and on average it meant that for every dollar that was spent in the region, another 48 cents was re-spent through the supply chain. So that relationship that we had before, the $16 million in direct expenditure and the $7 million that was indirect, is approximately that 48 cents being spent as it flies through the region. So that's update. So hopefully you'll all be in a position to do that. And if you want some support from WDA, I'm sure that Mark and Vanita and maybe even Melissa, if she's around, still available to help, might be able to source some of the figures that we had for your individual event to be able to refer on to calculate that. Secondly, demonstrating how events compare with businesses. And I think this is important. This is a graph that shows from Australian Bureau of Statistics figures how many businesses there are in each of the shires and the rural city of Horsham around the region, how much they turn over per year. You can see that 19% of businesses in the region, roughly 19%, have a turnover of less than $50,000 a year. Another 32% have a turnover between $50,000 and $200,000 a year. And then the next level up, between $200,000 and $1.9 million, 41.8% of businesses. So the lion's share, a huge proportion of businesses in the Wimmera region have turnovers in that range of less than $2 million. And only 6 or 7% have more than that. So the very biggest businesses, there's only a handful of those that turn over 2 to 5 million or 5 to 10 million or more than 10 million. So when we look at the value of our events, the average event in Horsham, for example, was $269,000, just the ones that we looked at this year. The overall average was $360,000. The smaller events in the other shires, Hindmarsh and West Wimmera and Yarra Yambiak, were $81,000, and the Northern Grampians average events were $1.1 million. So when you can see how when they plot those against the average businesses, they're up in amongst the top half in some cases of business turnovers in the area. So an event that might only go for 2 or 3 days is making a contribution to the region that's as equivalent to as many, lots of businesses who turn over that sort of money in a whole year. So that's an important thing to present to people when you're asking for sponsorships or showing how significant it is. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about showing the contribution that events make to total tourism. Of the 41 events, we estimated the average size that I showed on that previous graph, 1.1 million in the Northern Grampians, 268,000 in Horsham, 80-odd thousand in the other shires, an overall average of 360,000. Now, if we were to just broadly assume that those 41 events held in 3 months were going to be repeated for the other 9 months of the year, it would mean that we'd have about 164 events over 12 months. And if they were evenly distributed, splitting those 55 to Horsham, 55 to the other shires and 54 to the Northern Grampians, the direct contribution from visitation would be huge. I showed you before how much the Northern Grampians economy was in terms of tourist visitation. And if those events were repeated throughout the year, that would make up 56% of the total tourist expenditure in the Shire. Now, obviously, that's extremely unrealistic. So what it really means is that those 6 events that we looked at in the 3 months during autumn were probably amongst the biggest of the events that are held throughout the year, including the Stall Gift and the Grape Escape. So even if we just applied the regional average, it would still suggest that events in Northern Grampians are somewhere in the order of about 18% of the tourist economy. Applying the same logic in Horsham shows that it would be 14% of the tourist economy, and in the other shires, 4% of the tourist economy. Now, I don't know exactly how reasonable or unreasonable that is, because we're just taking a blanket approach to say that the events that we measured in autumn are going to be repeated at other times. But even if we make allowances for the fact that autumn probably is a big event time of the year, my overall suggestion is that the events probably do contribute somewhere in the order of 10 to 15% of the total direct tourism economy around the region. I've got a question mark next to that because it's just a guess, but it's an informed guess based on what it looks like. And bear in mind that we did just miss some of the big events as well by starting on the 22nd of March. We were able to get in quite a few of the events, for example, that were held on that the Labor Day long weekend at the beginning of March, like the Horsham fishing competition and others. So 10 to 15% of the total direct tourism economy seems like the right order of magnitude to me for these events. Now, so far we've just talked about dollars, about economy, but it's really important to point out that events are about a lot more than just dollars, and there's a lot of other things that we should be taking into account in pointing out how significant they are. Some of the things that I think are really valuable to note is that events help to raise the profile of the region, particularly when they're promoted beyond the region. And, you know, it's clear, for example, that probably everybody in Australia knows about the Stall Gift, for example, and probably most people around country Victoria know about some of the smaller events during that time, like the Japarrot fishing competition and other events like that. They may not be quite widely as known as around the whole state or country, but they're certainly known in country Victoria. So raising the profile of the region is really important. Generating interest in living and investing in the region. having people come to the region for events is often a precursor to them deciding that this is not a bad place to spend some time. It's got, uncrowded environment and lots of health and recreation opportunities and all the services we need. And it can lead to people deciding to invest or retire in the region or relocate to the region. Of course, we've referred to this before, that there's enormous social and health and well-being benefits by participating in events. And the volunteers in particular generate huge health and well-being benefits from being involved. It gives them a real purpose, especially older volunteers who rely on their contribution as one of their main outlets for social interaction and reducing social isolation. I think in this context, it's important to remember back or hark back to the 15,000 odd hours that we mentioned before of volunteer contribution, and trying to keep those people on board. And one of the other things that we measured in this study that I haven't referred to in the economic contribution is we asked people how much they were communicating with their volunteers and with their other committee members. And I think we were surprised to find that 16% said that they hadn't really had any meaningful communication with their volunteers or some of their committee members since the event had been cancelled or postponed. And we think that's potentially an area that organisers should concentrate on, is to continue to find a way to keep people informed. We also asked them how they maintain communications, and at that stage, the lion's share of communications was just through telephone or emails. The sort of thing that we're doing now, having a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting or a team meeting, only 8% of the events managers at that stage were using those as a way of keeping in touch. I've got no doubt that if we were to do the survey now, that would have gone up substantially. But back at the time, which was during April and May, it was only 8%. So the fact that it really is important to volunteers to stay involved, we think keeping in touch, continuing to celebrate the contribution that they make, and is an important part, not only of keeping them on tap for the future, but also for continuing to generate those social and health and wellbeing benefits. And then lastly, to give the region a long-term reputation themed around certain events. I can envisage the Wimmera region building its reputation as an event-based location for things like fishing events, for country music, for agri-tourism, for a focus on the environment, and even for history and culture. And we're seeing some of that already starting to emerge. There's no doubt that the history and culture reputation of the region has had a boost with the solo art trail that started in Yarriambiack and has now spread to some of the other shires like Hindmarsh and Bull Oak. And the associated history that goes with that, like visitation to things like the stick shed and some of the agricultural equipment museums like Woods Museum in Rapanyup and the museum at Warwick-Nabil and so on, are all contributing to that history and culture one. Starting to get a reputation for country music, certainly the Country Music Festival at Charlie Grah and the one at Horsham are both building momentum over time. Agri-tourism, obviously, because of the focus on grains research in Horsham and Birchip Cropping Group and so on, are right for giving the region another theme around that. And I think those sorts of things, themed events that the region can get a reputation for, could be used to generate support for the development of other tourist attractions that flow on to that. So the pubs and clubs should benefit from that. The lakes and weir pools around the region that have now got pretty permanent water through the contribution of the Wimmera Mallee pipeline. And of course, the long-standing environmental and wildlife attractions of the region with the desert environments and the broadacre environments. So it's not just about dollars, even though the dollars do make you sit up and take notice. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, Vanita. I don't know whether you've received any questions during the course of that, but keen to see whether we have.
Thanks, Wayne. That was certainly very insightful, and I'm always amazed at the information that you can present. You do an amazing job, and I'm sure that that's been beneficial for everyone that's joined us today. We did have a question come through earlier in the day via email, and that was around sort of what, due to the impact on events, what support may be forthcoming for events. Now, we know that there are potentially support packages that many event organisations will be eligible for. However, they are still very much in the works, and nothing officially released as yet through both, well, federal, state and local governments. So I think we're all waiting and watching very intently to see what support will be made available and who will be eligible for that. So that's very much a case of watch this space. We also had a comment come through in relation to the Grampians Grape Escape. And I believe that they've done some own surveys of their the people that attend the Grape Escape, and 75% of those respondents of those surveys had said they do plan to return to the region prior to the event being held again next year. So that's very, very positive. And it just shows the importance of events do introduce people to our region sometimes. And once they've come that first time and get a feel for our region and what it offers, you know, it does create that return visit. So that's wonderful as well. And I do open it up now to anybody else that might like to ask a question or have a comment. At this stage, you can certainly unmute yourself if you'd like to speak, or you can pop it into the chat. Nothing at this stage. I think it's been wonderful, Wayne, the way that you've been able to take the information from those surveys, present to us the impacts, but also demonstrate a way that our event organisations and community groups can utilise that information to go forward. We know the importance of events for our region. You've demonstrated that, obviously through your economic figures, but also, as you've pointed out, the importance for our community spirit, for our volunteers, and it is part of what makes our region such a great place to live, with so many vibrant and varied events, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and
So
we didn't make the offer that we could, if any particular event organiser is interested, I guess we can give them the details of what we estimated their event to contribute in total. Obviously, I can't do that as a group because each one of them is individually confidential. But maybe if somebody is representing a particular event and wants to get the ball started in terms of making a regular assessment of how much they could contribute, then we might be able to share their details because it's confidential to them for each particular event.
That's wonderful. That's a very generous offer, and I have no doubt that there'll be a few people following up with that. A few comments coming through saying that it's been a great presentation, so thanks, Wayne, and also whether or not a copy of the presentation will be made available, and yes, it will. So we will send out a copy of the link to anybody that would like that. So certainly you can contact myself through email at vtaylor@wda.org.au, and we can forward you out a copy of the presentation. And also the actual report itself is available also for people that would like a copy. Yes.
Can I just, there was one question that came in to me, a private question, Vanita, wasn't shared with everybody else, but I probably need to answer it because maybe everybody else is confused too. The question came from Justine King, and just pointing out that Great Western is in northern Grampians, and I didn't intend to suggest that I didn't think it was. What I was saying was that we'd actually classified an event that called itself the Greater Western Swimming Carnival, and I assumed that with that name it was probably being staged in Great Western, which it wasn't. I read it as Great Western Swimming Carnival, and it was actually Greater Western, so it was being held in Horsham. So we had to reallocate it across to Horsham. It wasn't a Great Western event. Yes, obviously there was a couple of events in Great Western that we did include. So thanks for that question, and apologies for not being clear.
Vanessa, I had a question. Wayne's been our presenter, but I didn't know where he was from or what role he was playing.
Do you want me to?
Yes, absolutely, Wayne. You're probably most qualified.
Okay, I'm from Street Rhyme, which is a consulting organisation, but I've been working with WDA and its predecessors since 1982, I think. So,
I assumed you might have been a consultant, but I didn't know. I didn't know whether you worked for WDA or whether you were a consultant. Yeah, so thank you.
And Mark Fletcher, who is with WDA, as most people would know, has also pointed out that the actual report itself has been circulated to another number of areas of government as an advocacy document. So this information is out there, and it will be part of building that, part of the picture to generate support for our region and our events, and why your participation was so important for the future of our events, and hopefully getting the support that we all need to move forward. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I know everybody's probably joined us on our lunch breaks and have very busy days. So if there's any other questions, please certainly let me know. Otherwise, we can wrap this up. And once again, I would like to thank Wayne for your presentation and your wonderful insights, and for everybody that was a part of this project for your contribution and for joining us today. Hope you have a great day.